Okay, so today in PIXLR Editor, we are going to zombify a portrait. So we're going to play around with some layer modes, some opacity, play around with some textures and different things like that. So first, go ahead and open up your image. I have a already zombified looking image of myself, looking pretty tired, dark circles, but we will make it work. So first, we're going to open up that image, and then we are going to go up to layer, and we are going to add an image as a layer. And I have provided for you some PNG skulls. Now, you are welcome to find your own PNGs, make your own PNGs. I'm just providing a few for you. Because I am looking straight ahead, I'm going to be choosing the skull that is looking straight ahead as well. Before I play around with layer modes, I'm going to try to resize this as best as I can. It's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to try to match up the dark eyes to my skull the best as I can. So while I have this skull layer highlighted, I'm going to click those three dots to get my menu up, and I'm going to play around with the layer blend mode. Now, there's a ton of different ones that you can play around with, and I would recommend that you just look through them. Each one kind of looks different depending on what you're going for. A lot of different examples. So play around, find one that you like, kind of like hard light, and then also play around with transparency or the opacity. So you can play around with that and make it as dark or as light as you might want. Once you are satisfied there, go ahead and click off. And we're going to play around with the erase tool a little bit. So I have to make sure that I am selecting that skull layer when I do this. And I am going to click on the eraser tool. I can play around with opacity. I can play around with brush size. But I don't want this skull to appear on my whole face. So I'm just going to go in and I'm going to kind of give myself half of a skull. And, you know, if you mess up, you can Control Z or Edit Undo to get it back. I think I do want some of that skull nose showing. Okay, so I think I'm pretty satisfied there. Can zoom in a bit, see if I'm happy. I think I'm going to get rid of some of the skull over here that's sticking out past my hairline. Once I am satisfied there, I can go back to my background layer and I can play around with this tool that's called Dodge and Burn. So I want to darken some of my areas. So once again, I can play around with strength. I can play around with brush size. My eyes are already pretty dark underneath, but I can play around and I can add some more darkened areas. You might just want to play around with your brush size, play around with your strength. I'm just going to give myself a little bit more dark circles under my eyes. I can darken my skin. I have to be careful. I don't like the way that it made my lips a little bit pinker, so I'm going to get rid of that. Just darken up some of the areas that you might wish. So it can look a little bit dirty, a little bit bruised. I think I'm just going to stop there for demonstration purposes. So the second thing that we're going to add an image layer as is going to be a textured background. And I'm going to provide you with a cracked texture. Once again, you can find your own if you want. So I'm going to go back to my layer, add image as layer, and I'm going to choose a cracked texture. Once again, I want to play around with the layer mode. So you can just play around with the transparency, or you can also play around with those layer modes again. I kind of like the texture of that overlay. Let's see what else I like. Oh, lighten is kind of cool. I think I'm going to play around with lighten and the transparency. And I kind of like the way that that looks there. So I can leave it as is, or once again, making sure that I'm selected onto that cracked texture background, I could go back with the eraser and I could erase anywhere that I don't want that texture at. So if I only wanted it to appear on my face, I could potentially erase the areas that I don't want it to show up at. Okay, so play around with your textures. And once you're happy and satisfied and you know that you don't need to play around with your layers and textures anymore, I want you to go up to layer and flatten your image so there's one cohesive layer again. And the last thing that we can do is play around with color balance. So under adjustments, under color balance, you can play around with shadows, midtones, highlights. You can play around, zombies are usually a little bit more green, so I can play around with that green level. I could play around with my blues and make it look a little bit more aged. I can play around with shadows. So really just kind of play until you are satisfied with your zombified portrait. I recommend just playing. You don't know. Ooh, I kind of like that one. Don't know what you're going to get unless you experiment. So I think I'm satisfied there. I'm going to click apply, and I feel like I've done a good job zombifying that portrait. I might go in and darken some of these areas back here. I don't really like how I have a glare in the background. I might have left some textures in, but that is how you zombify a portrait. When you are done, click File and Save. Rename it. So I'm just going to call this one Cut Zombie 2.